In the late 1960s, American cinema is in free fall. By 1970, box office admissions have dwindled to 15 million a week, down from 78 million in 1946. America is in the throes of a cultural revolution. Interests have changed. The studio movies no longer appeal to young people. With a TV set in every home and flower power all the rage, Hollywood is struggling. American youth rejects traditional conservative American values. Along comes a new generation of filmmakers, free of the constraints of 1950s conformism, determined to seize power from the studios and play by new rules. It is in this context that Martin Scorsese shoots Mean Streets, Jerry Schatzberg, The Panic in Needle Park, and Francis Coppola, Apocalypse Now, 3 cult films. The traditional hero, played by the likes of Gary Cooper, Henry Fonda, and John Wayne, has given way to a new and different generation of atypical actors.
I never met John Wayne. The only time I ever was near John Wayne, and this is why I always think, like, forget, you know, now he should have known. It was in the commissary. You know what the commissary is? Yes, at Warner Brothers. I had long hair, and I was wearing a leather vest and jeans, and I was editing a rock documentary for Francois Reichenbach. Yes, he was in Paris. I was editing this at Warner Brothers. I had just come out to California, and there I was in the commissary. There'd be all these actors, he's in there, so-and-so, and I was kind of new. I was trying to get Mean Streets made, but I couldn't get it made. And so a year later, I finally got it made with Roger Corman. But in the meantime, I was editing, so I would sit in the commissary, and one day I sat right behind me, right next to me was John Wayne. So I just sat down right here, and there was 2 people eating with me, and John Wayne did this. He looked back at me like so. He got up and moved his chair away from me because he didn't want to be sitting too close to me. I had long hair, dirty hippie, which I was not a hippie. I don't know, you know, just a long, everybody had long hair at the time. And I said, oh, I see. All right. We still love you, I said. In my mind, my heart, I said, I still love you. You'll never know. You'll never know. It's okay. It's okay.
The Searchers, released in March 1956, is an enormous box office hit, but the film is panned by critics, and the Academy Awards go to big studio productions like Around the World in 80 Days and The King and I. And yet, the new wave of directors such as Scorsese, Lucas, Spielberg, Milius, and Schrader identify more with The Searchers than with big productions that seem increasingly out of step with the concerns of the younger generation. John Ford, who has turned John Wayne into a racist anti-hero 10 years earlier, is to be a role model for these young directors. When Martin Scorsese shoots Who's That Knocking at My Door in 1969, the relationship between Harvey Keitel and his wife is inspired by John Wayne and Natalie Wood, and his film even features a clip from The Searchers. According to the famous critic Joseph McBride, The Searchers is a cult movie for the new generation. As a teenager, Steven Spielberg even filmed a short homage to it in his garden. And Buddy Holly's most famous hit, That'll Be the Day, quotes the famous line from the film. All the young directors of the 70s cite The Searchers as an inspiration and quote it in their own films. Steven Spielberg in Close Encounters, George Lucas in Star Wars, Paul Schrader in Hardcore, John Milius in The Wind and the Lion, Michael Cimino in The Deer Hunter, Jean-Luc Godard in Weekend, and of course Martin Scorsese in Mean Streets and Taxi Driver.
I remember the night my friends and I, who are young Italian-American boys, we saw the film. We were 13 years old in VistaVision, which is a big difference. The part of the art of the film, even more so, was the use of VistaVision in Monument Valley was extraordinarily. If you ever saw that projected, it was overwhelming, the visual clarity and the beauty of it. And so the landscape was a major character, is what I'm saying. And we then saw the film as we got to be 15, 16 years old, 17 years old. It was always on television in black and white, and we always watched it and watched it. And one night in the bar, we're drinking, and my friend says, you know, in The Searchers, he says, yeah, there's a scene where he's watching his brother, or his sister-in-law take his coat and fold the coat. But, you know, I said, I think that he was in love with her. I said, you know, I think you're right. And this is not a film critic. We were the young kids. He said, boy, that's interesting, because we knew John Ford's name by then. Boy, that was really nice the way John Ford just put that in there. You know, we felt about that the whole basis of the story is based on that one shot, a medium shot of her. It's not even a close-up. It's Ward Bond notices it, and he turns away. He turns away, and that's it's like poetry to us, you know. And that's what. And again, on a big screen, the image of her folding the coat in VistaVision is much more powerful. On television, she becomes this big. You know, on a small screen here, you know, it's okay. But on a giant screen, he didn't need a close-up, you know. And so it was just average film goers beginning to discover the film, the depth of the film, as we viewed it and as we got older.
Go, Martin, please.
Stand aside, Martin.
No, you don't, Ethan. Ethan, no, you don't!
Stand aside.
The Searcher still holds up in terms of his racism, in terms of his own demons inside himself. And the camera tracking into his face when he turns and he sees the two little Indian girls, the two white girls who were taken by the Indians. He's absolutely, the look in his eyes, that's an extraordinary actor. And also very brave for the time, because he was a highly unpleasant character. A highly unlikable character.
The Searchers influences these directors because it turns archetypal American hero John Wayne into an anti-hero, sweeping away the valiant leading men from Hollywood's golden age. Leading the way is Warren Beatty in Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde. Beatty hires Arthur Penn to direct. With the Vietnam War raging, Penn doesn't want a sanitized film. It has to be bloody. The heroes are outsiders who rob banks and commit murders. This new generation of filmmakers wants absolute control over their films, even if it means increased costs. So Warren Beatty takes on the producer's role and fights with Warner to get his own way.
That was the first film that I did as a production designer, so I was feeling my way too. And I was very eager to leave Hollywood and go out and make a movie in a real place. More or less all the films were shot in the studios. Jack Warner certainly wanted it to be shot in the studios, backlots, but Warren persisted that it should be shot in that area, you know, in Dallas, around Dallas.
Where you going?
Get away!
Bonnie!
Go home!
Please, honey, don't never leave me without saying nothing.
It was the real place. It was the real thing. It had blood in it. It was. The bottom line is that there were two stick-up people, and they're glamorized. It was the Depression. If you had to pick sides and you were poor and didn't have anybody to speak for you, and the banks are closing everything you have, these people look good in comparison. They were glamorous. They were out there. They had guns. They shoot. They take money. You never see them shoot anybody, really. It's a formula they still use today, right? You can be a killer, I mean, not a killer, but a criminal, but just don't cross the line, you know, so we can still adore you.
Frank just figured on some easy pickings, didn't you, Frank? You know, Texas Ranger, you ain't hardly doing your job. You ought to be home protecting the rats and poor folk, not out chasing after us. I know, but we'll take a second. We were looking at it. But
Hang him. I don't know.
Take his picture. Then everybody's gonna see Captain Frank Hammer of the Texas Rangers with the Barra Gang, and all of us just as friendly as pie.
Now, you know, we are just about the friendliest folks you would ever want to meet.
I remember Warren showing me a letter from Jack Warner to Warren Beatty, mentions other stupid things, kind of like not to show products like Coca-Cola. You know, their idea of Bonnie and Clyde, and later I can say the same story about Godfather, is to make it, you know, the cheapest way, make it in Burbank. It's, you know, it's $20 cheaper today. And don't show Coca-Cola because it's some kind of product deal or some kind of deal. That was basically the studio. I mean, you could multiply that by 10,000, and that was the studio.
The American hero is dying. The stars and stripes are burning on campuses across the country. A social revolution is underway. The innocence of the post-war years is over. The Kennedy era a distant memory. The Vietnam War fuels the public's uncertainties. Drugs, sexual liberation, and hippies have arrived. The USA is bogged down in Vietnam. Race riots are breaking out all over the country, while the Black Panthers emerge as the African-American revolutionary movement. Anti-establishment protests flare up throughout the nation. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis.
So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
2 months later, on June 6, 1968, while campaigning to become president, Robert Kennedy is assassinated in Los Angeles. It's the Prague Spring, and Russian tanks enter Czechoslovakia. The whole of Europe is rising up.
I was in Paris in May of '68. I had no idea what was happening. I was at the screening that Truffaut did, the night Truffaut, you were there, of La Mariée était noire. I was there at that screening. He also showed Marnie. And he came out, he talked about Bernard Herrmann, and then he talked about Henri Langlois and all this, and I couldn't quite understand all the French. And so, I went out the next day. There was all kinds of trouble. I tried to get a taxi. He said, la grève, and I thought it was just the taxis that were on strike. I was pretty much politically completely naive. I had no idea of many things. I was not as sophisticated as the European, or sophisticated in the sense that even at New York University was the first time that I met Jewish kids who, because usually I knew Jewish doctors. And that was it, basically. So there were Jewish kids, different points of view, and also young men and women from Greece, who were were on the left side, because at that time there was a political takeover in Greece, if you remember, by the Americans and everything else. And so there was even fights between who was a better composer, musician, Theodorakis or Hadjidakis. And because politically, the left liked Theodorakis and the right liked Hadjidakis. I like both, but Theodorakis is quite extraordinary, I must admit. Hadjidakis, though, did the music for America. Kazan's film is very beautiful. And but Theodorakis is quite extraordinary, just beautiful. Of course, he was in jail, and so I became very aware of not just it was not a label of be a leftist or a communist, but these were people, young people, and we were together. And so I may not have shared the political points of view, but at that time we were aware of it. And for example, one had to take a stand. You're either for the war in Vietnam or you're against the war in Vietnam. I was against, because a lot of the people that I appreciated the way they thought, and the way they spoke, and the way they acted, and the way they behaved, and the way they put themselves and their own body on the line in the streets, I agreed with them, and I saw that they made sense. They made sense to me, as opposed to other friends of mine whom I grew up with who split with me. They would not deal with me anymore, because I really felt that the outside world, the ones in the outside world, the ones who were reacting against this war and this whole way of living, they had more validity and really was the right way to go. By 1970, things were changing.
When you go to 2008 and you look back and you say, well, these